Mesdames,
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and dear friends, today we're welcoming Thomas Turner on the chair Sustainable Development, Energy and Society, sponsored by the Total Group. The application of this outstanding professor and researcher was supported by Roger Guénery, who will be introducing our new colleague in a few minutes. I'd like to take this opportunity to say how important these multi-annual or annual chairs are for Collège de France, because they help to widen and broaden the offer and supply of courses and seminars, in addition to the other chairs with a format which is not always compatible with the transient chairs. And also sometimes what is provided by the Collège is not always competitive, to encourage some of our colleagues to leave their universities and to settle forever with us. We shouldn't be sad about it, but rather we should anticipate our thrill in welcoming our dear colleagues. Dear Roger, now you have the floor to introduce Mr. Sterner. Mr. Administrator, dear Alain, dear friends and dear colleagues and dear Thomas, the annual chair on sustainable development, energy, environment and society has welcomed Henri Ridon, a population specialist, an economist, Nicolas Stern, a chemist of materials for energy, Jean-Marie Tanascon, an agrochemist of biofuels, Mr. Colonna, a specialist of the Earth observation from space, Ali Cazenave, an expert on biodiversity, Gilles Boeuf, and a specialist of mineral resources, Mr. Callas. Thomas, you are an economist. Nobody's perfect. And I'm pleased to see that you're the 8th one on our list in this chair. Some years ago, I had pleaded to say that such a cycle, which started with population and economics, that social sciences should help close this cycle. So the application of Thomas Turner was submitted to the usual procedure. And since in the meantime, I became an honorary professor, his application was submitted by Edouard Barr and then approved by the group of professors. It's not because of an almost homonymy with Nicolas Stern's name that you were asked, but rather also for the original features of your background and research work. First of all, your work combines great stability and variety. Stability because you are at the Göteborg University in Sweden, where you presented your thesis in 1986 before becoming assistant, and then professor. The chair you still hold there for 20 years. Thomas has developed an environmental economics unit at Gothenburg, which has often trained PhDs, students coming from developing countries, but you're also an advisor, an opinion leader, and you have spent quite some time in other research centers. You work also been involved in the 2013 IPCC report as an author of chapter of Group 3 on mitigation of climate change. Second category, you've also been a researcher at Resource for the Future at Statistics Norway. You've been visiting chief economist the Environmental Defense Fund, member of the research committee of several developing countries in Africa, in China and Southeast Asia. And for your long stays, you've stayed in Montevideo in Mexico, Tonbridge, Oslo, Washington, and in Grenoble in France. And I had almost forgotten that you spent part of your time of your university studies in Montpellier. That has been an opportunity for you to learn French. Now, the time now when you're coming to join this chair in Paris is coming in a timely manner. I know you're interested in transport, the agricultural resources management, but a lot of your work on environmental economics also deals with energy and climate. And that's a timely coincidence as Paris is about to host the COP21. Some of the head of chapters of your research will come as a good example: the social cost of carbon, the redistributive effect of the carbon tax, the discount rate and long-term decisions. This is a topic that we have also explored, suggesting similar approaches. And I would like to make a parenthesis to say that on October the 29th and 30th, there will be a conference here on the economics of climate change that you have organized. And I close this little ad at this stage. And I also would like to say that your work has been renowned internationally because of a high volume of papers published. You were awarded the Merval Prize in Sweden in 2008, and in 2008 and 2009, you've also chaired the association, the European Association of the Environment and Resources, and the presence of Thomas here at Collège de France this year at this particular moment is particularly meaningful. Now I'm giving the floor to Thomas. Thank you very much, Roger. Dear Administrator, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and a great pleasure to be a guest professor and a visiting professor here in this beautiful house, Collège de France. I would like to thank you because this is a very important moment for me. But soon, in Paris, as you know, there will be an even more important meeting, an even more serious meeting, that of the United Nations Conference on Climate Change. And several of us are rather concerned as to the outcome of this COP21. Are we going to work and suggest sufficiently and sufficiently quickly enough to cope with this climate change challenge? And we do not always agree on the instruments to be used, and I will describe these instruments later. But first of all, I'd like to review other environmental problems, because the climate is not the only problem. What is an environmental problem? Of course, the environment is not the source of problem. It's rather man that is the source of problem. The mere fact of being able to observe the Earth from the moon has helped men to transform our understanding of our position in the universe. When I was young, it was thought that waste would disappear if we threw them at sea. And OECD had, as an environmental policy, to promote the idea of having higher stacks, because we wanted to push the waste further away. But when we watch this image, we see the Earth is a single unit with this very thin film covering the Earth, and the Earth which is hosting all the ecosystems. Everything that is life takes place in this very thin, under this very thin layer. And it is the meeting of unique coincidences that has allowed for life to emerge. And we have to learn to take care of it. Today, we are faced with a plethora of planet-related challenges, not only the climate change or the global warming we're talking about. We're also talking about a loss of diversity, as well as all the other forms of pollution. In our environment, there is an increasing number of potentially harmful substances which may come from the geosphere, that is of geologic origin, but which could have toxic effects in the biosphere or chemical compounds that have been produced by the industry, the short and long-term effects of those are quite often unknown. These substances are all over the place in our environment, from the ice up to ice cap up in the bodies of newborns. Last week, I was in Lyon and then in Grenoble, and I've had the opportunity to watch the premiere of a film on the life of the great glaciologist Claude Lorius. And it was very moving, very touching. And he talked about the awareness-raising effect of the fact that in the Antarctic they had found traces of nuclear tests. It was thought that the pole was untouched, and it is thanks to Claude Lorius, and I didn't know that, and I've used this diagram for 30 years. It's my favorite diagram, and I didn't know that it was that I owe it to Claude. You see here on this chart the carbon oxide content and levels for hundreds of thousand years. We economists often talk about cost in the long term, and long term for us is 20 years, but here we're talking 500,000 years. And you see how regular this CO2 emissions have been over the years. And in fact, Claude told us the story of how he had the idea of finding carbon dioxide. Life in the Antarctic bases was rather harsh. It was minus 30 degrees. That's a heat wave. It should have been minus 50 or minus 60. One day, a researcher came, and they had waited for him for a year. And to celebrate the arrival of this colleague, they took a whiskey. And they put some ice cubes in the whiskey, and Claude noticed that there were bubbles in the ice cubes. And then he thought, well, this air has been trapped in this ice for years, and that's how he had the idea of trying to measure the carbon dioxide contents in the ice. So maybe we should drink more whiskey. That's good for research. In my lifetime and that of my children over the last 30 years, this index has changed by a factor of 60 and is now reaching 400 ppm approximately. Similar events were observed in the past, but it took some thousands of years before the ppm levels went up. But as far as we're concerned, it took only 30 years. Maybe in Scandinavia, in Nordic countries, we will have tropical conditions, but we don't have the biological conditions. And we do not have all the infrastructure and the bacteria that are needed. It takes a very long time for ecosystems to change, but such an important and huge change over 30 years means that it is obviously a challenge for ecosystems. So we should wonder how far humanity can damage the environment without suffering the consequences, heavy consequences of this change. And that's by trying to answer this question that a team of international researchers has introduced in 2009 the concept of planetary boundaries, and this was published in Nature. That is, ecological thresholds, critical thresholds, not to be trespassed or exceeded, to avoid the Earth system to tilt in a completely different condition and which could be less favorable to the development of human societies. This is a chart showing geologic timescales. There are many timescales, and there are experts here in Collège de France who know it better than I do. But here, we know that the Earth has had million years now. The period we're more interested in it is Holocene. It is the period during which human beings have emerged. Holocene is a period of outstanding stability that has helped civilization to develop. And it is not to jeopardize this stability that we have designed this concept of planetary boundaries. That is, planetary boundaries are an effort aimed at conceptualizing those boundaries not to be crossed. Humanity, mankind, has become the main driving force of living condition on the Earth. And this is why some researchers have called this current period Anthropocene. I don't know what my geologist colleagues would say, but it is not truly recognized as a geologic period, but much more than a play on word. It is also a way of reminding us that we are controlling our fate, that our fate is in our hands, and that if the fate of the planet is in our hand, we also need to take up this challenge in very consciously. We are the pilot of this space shuttle, so to speak, and we have to learn how to steer it. And this leads me to my main topic. How can we manage a global economy for the sake of a sustainable development? How can we design and implement the necessary policy instruments? I think that, first of all, there's a need for a diagnosis. Just like when you go to your physician, it's not only about buying drugs. First of all, you need to have a proper diagnosis. You need to understand the disease. Why do we have environmental problems? That's the work of the diagnosis. This is a book that I have written on this topic and that I use for the thesis students, and sometimes that I present to the ministries of environment of this world. But after the diagnosis, then you have a review of instruments, the menu of instruments that I will describe later on, instruments that are aimed at correcting these problems. And finally, we need to analyze and select and implement these instruments. But then you might ask, why a diagnosis? Why are we destroying our house? Maybe it's human nature, greed, envy, ignorance. Is man stupid, selfish? Does he lack any self-control? Well, yes, maybe. Some more than others. But we economists believe that it is rather the structure of the game of the economy that is involved. Let's move on to the most important slide of this presentation. Do you see anything? Can you see anything? That's the theory of economics. The most important theory is the invisible hand of Adam Smith. It's the market mechanisms. Everybody talks about the market, demand, supply. But not that many of us are sure that we actually understand how it works. And since Adam Smith, we have known that the market can be a very efficient tool, much more efficient than other alternative ideas. But in many instances, the market doesn't work. The market fails. There are market failures like externalities. And the public goods, the information asymmetries, and these market failures are the driver for the design of new instruments. And externalities, for instance, the effect generated by a company, such as smoke here. This is the typical example. We all know that smoke is bad for our health. That's an actual fact. But it's not the object of the market. It's a direct effect. And therefore, it's not factored in by the economy. We've succeeded in rather reducing quite a lot of emission of toxic products, but in many instances we've pushed them away, just like I was saying about the waste that was dumped at sea or with the higher stacks. And that's how we've cleaned our air. But today, the distance between polluters and those who suffer from pollution in space and time has grown bigger. But it's very tangible. When we drive a car here in Paris, we are involved in the drowning of many people in Bangladesh in some decades from now. But this distance, of course, conceals these indirect effects and does challenge the implementation of some policy instruments. Now, I'll be talking about my menu of instruments. And this effort to design a menu. But first of all, let's go through a historical review of the instruments. The first ones are the right to property. This is the basic instrument of all economic instruments. Without allocation of rights, the market cannot work. And the first instruments are to be found very simply in the very definition of property rights, such as fences, for instance. Be it a private property or a shared property or something that belongs to the state. And there are tools to protect these properties behind the fences, such as arrows or other warnings, such as those, for instance. And over time, we've seen that the instruments have become increasingly sophisticated. Many instruments have been put forward and set forth by states and governments, such as the carbon tax, the environmental taxing system, labels, and the instruments aimed at supporting new technologies and innovation. And I think that those instruments are very important, and I'll talk about them again in the future. I have a complex with regard to natural sciences, but I would have liked to organize these instruments in an elegant way, but it's not that easy. So what I have here is not as well organized as the table of elements. It's not that easy. But here is my menu. It has 4 categories. First of all, the instruments that do have a direct impact on price. Pricing is essential in the economy, of course, and there could be something like a tax, which, of course, would make the price higher, of course. The second column is putting together all the rights. The third column is about regulation. And the fourth one is legal instruments and information provision. And I'll talk about these 4 categories in turn, starting with the instruments that do have an impact on pricing. The tax is often called the Pigouvian tax from the economist Pigou, who advocated for levying a tax on items in the 1930s. Now, the level of the tax should match marginal damages. And several times we have seen the great difficulties in having a tax voted, like the carbon tax in France. I think it's the 3rd time in France that there is an attempt to vote on the carbon tax. And Sweden did work better. We have a very high carbon tax, and we've had it for many years. But I think that we're almost the only country that does have a carbon tax. Another instruments could be subsidies, but it's like a negative tax. You can have a combination of taxes and subsidies, like a reimbursed fees. It's like a tax that is paid on something that is harmful, but the agent doesn't go to the money is paid back to the polluter. Based on an effort. There are different models existing. In France, you've had the quasi-tax on sulfur and nitrogen oxide emissions, and the polluter paid, and the money was then allocated to the abatement cost of emissions. That's another French system, the bonus-malus on cars. It's like a tax on the most polluting cars that is levied on most polluting cars that finances a subsidy for those cars that will pollute less. Now, let's move on to something that is completely different. Let's move on to something completely different. Skeptical people are really doubtful as to the impact of prices and taxes, but I'm convinced of the opposite. Let's take this example. This is the number of weddings in Sweden. It was about 60,000 in the 1950s, and then it declined with the generation of the 1960s, 1968. And then suddenly, in 1989, there were 110,000 weddings celebrated in Sweden. And this was due to a change of the law regarding the benefits and allowances for the retirement of widows. Now, this is a very important decision, and that's part of people's private life. Now, if the marriage decision is driven by economic factors, I think it should be the same for the other love of our life, that is our car. People find it hard to recognize that incentives are driving the decision. They always say they don't have a choice. You know, the house, the kindergarten. I don't drive for my pleasure. It's because I have to drive distances to go here and there. But then statistics are showing that it's not exactly true. This on the left shows the price of oil in some countries that I have selected. The United States is the country where it's more pleasant to have a big car. Fuel is cheap, and it does have an impact on consumption, that is kilogram per capita, and oil consumption is closely related to the CO2 emissions. Now, if we move on to Italy, I always take the example of Italy. I don't know whether there are Italian people in this room, but they have the wisest governments. They've always had interesting environmental policies, because this is the country where the oil is at the highest price. And that's good for the environment, because the consumption of oil is very low in Italy. It's almost a miracle. I don't know what you think about it as economist, but fairly it's simple. When it's more expensive, you don't use it so much. You know, you make savings. But it's a secret. Don't say it to anyone. And that's why there are not that many waste around. Waste is something that doesn't have a price high enough for us to take care of it. And so when it's cheap, we should introduce instruments so as to make use of them as incentives. Now let's move on to the following column, that is the rights. As I said earlier, property rights, the right to own something, is critical, because without them there is no market mechanism, but sometimes they're difficult to imagine. Just like when we talk about the atmosphere, the air, it's difficult to imagine that we are the owner of the atmosphere, but in such settings, they could be a kind of proxy. We could have some rights to emit. That's a right that has been granted to me, Thomas Turner, to emit 1 ton of SO2 in the United States. I spent an interesting year there, and I wanted to contribute to clean the atmosphere. So there's 1 ton of SO2 less in the United States, thanks to the purchase that I made. When this program was developed, and about sulfur oxide emission, we calculated that the abatement cost of SO2 would be approximately $1,000 a ton. But I could buy my right for the price of $100, and it reflects technical progress. When companies are asked to reduce their emissions, they say, no, it's too expensive, too complicated, we can't do that. But if we set a price, if we create a market for it, then companies will try and find ways to be more efficient and pollute less. And thanks to technical progress, this is achievable. And this is why there are engineers. Now, let's move on to common goods. It's not only private property that guarantees efficiency. Elinor Ostrom, who was a Nobel Prize for Economy, has dedicated her professional life demonstrating that Hardin was wrong. Hardin is the author of The Tragedy of the Commons, and according to Ostrom, it's rather the tragedy of free access, when there is no control at all. And it leads to an over-exploitation. But rights to these commons may, under certain conditions, and this is why she's worked on this, and this has been the main topic of her research. So these rights can also lead to a sustainable exploitation. Let's move on to the third column of my menu, regulations. Regulation has the reputation of being non-flexible, and people wonder why the rules are so rigid. And why not give entrepreneurs the freedom to select the techniques by themselves? But it is a wrong contradiction. That's a misconception. Rules, indeed, are often rigid. For instance, that each plant, each factory should have a stack of at least 32 meters, or that each car should have a catalytic converter. However, it is also possible to set out rules that allow for flexibility for companies, like, for instance, that the emissions should be less than X milligrams of CO2 for each mile or each kilometer. It gives some leeway to companies and flexibility, sometimes maybe too much flexibility. Choosing an instrument is also something that affects what we perceive as the rights to nature in general. Let's take water, for instance. To whom does the water belong? Does it belong to the person who lives near the river where the water flows, or does it belong to the user who is endowed with the oldest historical rights, or does water belong to the state or to the community? And we know that the answers to this question will vary greatly a lot from one country to the next or over time. In Sweden, for instance, everybody enjoys the right to access a private property. For instance, you can go and pick fruit and mushrooms or camp one night on the property of somebody else for one night. Now, if you ever try to do that in the United States, you will learn very quickly that property rights are very different in the United States. Let's say, let's take the example of the rights to emission or to a frequency of 105.1 megahertz for radio frequencies. These rights have not always existed. They have been designed recently because we needed them. There could also be rights which could be granting subsidy to the polluter or the polluted person. Let's take the example of tax. People talk about taxes or permits, and there is often a confusion between both, because people think that a tax is an instrument on pricing, and that gives the state a right of property, and that permits, emission permits, are often granted for free, and therefore implicitly it gives some right to the polluter over the environment. But it does not necessarily need to be like this. Some theories say that sometimes we need an instrument that is based on quality. Sometimes we want to have instruments that is based on pricing. If we want to have a quantity-based instrument, we may also decide to have other instruments, such as a permit to auctions. This will preserve the rights of the state, and it's more comparable to a tax. Now, when it comes to traffic in large towns worldwide, quite often there is a lane that is reserved for HOV vehicles, that is high occupancy vehicles, that is to try and make sure that there is less traffic jam. Economists have almost systematically said it would be better to set a price on this. But the problem with such regulations is that the market will find some ways to circumvent the regulation. And in this case, this is what is done here in the Philippines. They do have this HOV lane in the Philippines, and it does have a positive impact because it has given jobs to women who've just had a baby. They do a kind of hitchhiking. Drivers pay them some petty money, a small amount of money, and then there are two people in the car. So these women plus the driver, and quite often there are three, so two women plus the driver, and therefore the driver is allowed to use the HOV lane. And after 10 kilometers, when they've arrived at destination, the driver will leave the travelers, go back walking to the initial place, and these women would do that all day long. It's a kind of job, but it's a bit of a perverse effect of the HOV lane system, and it does not reduce the traffic jam at all. Now let's move on to the fourth column, dealing with the other instruments, such as information. Information provision or information dissemination is often a very efficient method and quite often a prerequisite for the introduction of the other instruments. So it's quite often the first instrument that is being used. And in Indonesia, the environmental agency has realized that they had little power and authority over polluters because polluters could afford to have the best counselors and lawyers, and therefore they've tried to design a simpler instrument, and they've just collected data about the industries and classified them under a program called Proper. A blue label for an industry, for a company, means that the company is compliant with the law, that the emissions have not exceeded what is actually allowed. Green is for those companies that have gone beyond and ahead of everything, that were proactive. The red were those that were non-compliant, and the black even worse. And apparently, simply communicating about these labels has had a quite significant effect rather quickly, and over 6 months, there was a change. Many companies have reduced their emissions, and they've moved up, for instance, from red to blue. In France, we know what is the value and the power of the system of appellation d'origine contrôlée. It's more or less the same principle. It's also a label. Instruments may not always be necessary. That's the only technical graph. You see that the marginal abatement cost and the tax objective here is to encourage companies to reduce their emissions so that the abatement cost is less than the tax, and companies will go for abatement. This is in red, the cost of abatement that is paid for by the companies. And companies also have to pay a tax here in blue. Sometimes companies complain. They complain that they have to pay twice. They have to pay to reduce the emissions for the to abate emissions, and they also have to pay a tax for the emissions that are unavoidable. So companies sometimes might then say, well, why don't we do it on a volunteer basis? We are going to reduce our emissions, so you don't need to levy a tax. We would just have to pay the abatement cost, and that would be great. We only pay for the abatement cost, and that is what we call the voluntary agreements. And it works pretty well in Japan. I worked for the IPCC 5 years writing a text on instruments, and one of the chapters in the latest IPCC report, and a Japanese representative said, every time we met, said, the best instrument is a voluntary agreement. And we said, okay, fine. If it works in Japan, fair enough. But in most countries, it doesn't work. But apparently, it works pretty well in Japan. I think that it works well in Japan, that it is successful because there is a kind of cartel in Japan, and they don't want to leave the initiative and the decision in the hands of the government. Even though they have to pay for a price for it, they will organize themselves and reduce their emissions. There are instruments everywhere. In May, June, in Sweden, I have a session that lasts for 5 weeks, a series of seminars where I talk about these instruments. But all this just to say that the banking sector is a highly regulated one. There are rules, there are procedures that could be an advantage or a drawback for renewables, for instance. So all the rules governing the economy do have an impact on the environment. There is just a need to study them thoroughly. When the time comes to select the instruments, we need to have selection criteria. We economists often think in terms of efficacy, as if it was the most important criterion. The purpose of efficacy will depend on the agent, that is, to make sure that there is a highest likelihood of abatement of emissions for a given cost. But it may not be the most important criterion. Quite often, we've found that equity, as perceived by the various stakeholders in the economy, as more important than efficacy, and it is key for the feasibility of this policy. That's also a secret. But policy making could be thought as being drafted a recipe by economists for the minister, but that's not the way it works. In reality, there is a strong presence of explicit or implicit lobbies in the decision-making process, and the power of lobbying organization is very important. And there are also various economic conditions to be accounted for. Let's take the example of monopolies. If there is a monopoly, it's already a situation where the prices may be too high and a supply that is not good enough. So the taxes will not work in a case of a monopoly. But let's take another example with the lobby organizations. Nigeria is an African country where there are many problems. Many people do not have access to basic needs, that is water, sanitation, health, and education. In such a country, the budget should be well thought and organized. Some 30% to 50% of the budget was used to subsidize the fuel industry. And that is really a scandal. The aftermath of this subsidization system is highly regressive because the rich people do have a car, and that is obvious. And I've had the opportunity to study this and published a book on this because people don't believe it, but that's the way it is. But when the president tried to ban these subsidies so that the budget would be allocated to more important objectives, there were riots everywhere. And some 50 people died. And it's not difficult to trigger violence in a country where the living conditions are so harsh. But in fact, the lobbies maybe of the road transportation companies and maybe fuel companies were behind these riots. They didn't go and demonstrate in the streets and say, it's bad for my Ferrari. They said it's bad for the poor people. But the poor people don't have access to education. Maybe they do not understand what economics is all about, and they might think that a subsidy is good. But if you think about it with a bit of hindsight, it is obvious that a subsidy is a substitute of another subsidy. Either you subsidize health services and education, water supply, or fuel. And it's up to the poor to decide, to choose. And it is obvious that for poor people, the main priority is not fuel. You will remember that the name of the president was Jonathan Goodluck. Is now the former president. Bad luck for him. Some problems, such as the global warming, is so complex that there are many things to be done, many instruments to be developed. It's very complicated. So we should combine various instruments. And that's also a difficult art. Some instruments can be combined together and others do not fit together. And they might have a negative effect on one and the other. And today there are only bad news about climate change. This is a graph which has just been published in Nature some 24 hours ago. I think it was at 6 p.m. yesterday. And I was the reviewer, the peer reviewer for this paper, and Nature has asked me to draft a comment about this paper because Nature has considered that this particular paper will be very important. But it's also very complicated. And we feared that it would be difficult to understand, so I drafted my comment to try and explain to the wider public what this paper is all about. And I've had many interviews today with the Swedish media and others. But in substance, this paper explains that the cost of the climate change would be much higher than what we had thought. And one of the diagrams to summarize this situation shows that economic growth and GDP are a function of the average temperature of the country. The optimum is 13 degrees. That's more or less what we have here. In Sweden, it's slightly less. And it means that the global warming might not be that harmful for Swedish people. But most countries worldwide are already too warm. The temperature is already too high. And the curve here shows the drawbacks. It's a bit non-symmetrical. The drawback of global warming in those countries that are already warm in temperature will be more harmful, so that there will be a major growth drop, and there will be a loss. There will be an economic decline, and there will be more inequalities worldwide. Warm countries will suffer more than those with a temperate climate. These are very bad news, particularly for Africa and many countries in Asia. Now let's try and talk about the negotiating process. There is a need for a treaty. Since we're talking about a common global good, it is of paramount importance that we reach an agreement. But this is what failed in Copenhagen. We've shown the powerlessness of the great powers of this world. And we are all concerned about what is going to happen in Paris in a month from now. Is it going to repeat itself? So in order to try and avoid this, policymakers have tried and changed the viewpoints. We're no longer trying to come to an agreement, a central agreement or convention based on a central concern that are that of the United Nations, but rather a decentralized kind of negotiation architecture. Each country will define its own objectives. That is, in terms of emission reduction, this is what is called INDCs, standing for Intended Nationally Determined Contributions. That is the key word for the Paris conference. And at least 3 of these words are a problem to me. Contribution is fine, but the 3 other words are a problem. Intended, that is what the country has planned. Nationally determined, that is each and every country will decide and determine these emissions for itself. And that is just a basic lesson from economics. We know that there are voluntary contributions in Europe. More or less 50% of our income is paid in taxes. And most of us in Europe as taxpayers and citizens pay our taxes, most of us, because we know that is necessary and that there is a good spending of money, that money is reasonably spent, but there's a need for coordination, because if it were good enough to have a contribution that is determined by the governments of those nations, and maybe the implementation will work, we don't know. But it is obvious that this instrument is weaker. But I don't want to be criticizing too much either, because we've seen that the centralized model, the one that came out of Copenhagen, has failed. So there's a need to try and something else. And maybe, indeed, we should see what countries are ready to do and try to have a common starting point. But even though we have a common starting point, we need to negotiate. We need to add up these nationally determined contributions and see whether it is sufficient. We know that we are getting closer to 4 degrees of global warming, so there is a need to have a negotiating process. It's just a starting point. Yeah, INDCs will just be a starting point. In the United States, many of my friends are more positive for Paris rather than at the time of Copenhagen. And they said that we've left the Kyoto mechanisms behind, that China has accepted to be committed and involved, and that maybe a decentralization would work better. It's an idea that has been more attractive to our colleagues in the United States. But it's a federal state, so it's difficult for such a country to be committed in these negotiations. And one of the most important political element would be the price of oil. I'm really concerned because I see that in the United States, the price of gas has been the lowest price over the last 10 years. They're just right in the boom of shale gas industry, and I don't think these are enabling conditions for policymakers to meet the objectives related to global warming and climate change. And also, we need to factor in the fact that there are many inequalities where emissions are very high, like in the United States, or other areas in countries where the emission levels are much lower. This means that it would be very difficult to design a policy. So in my opinion, quite frankly, the outlooks or the prospect of an agreement that will help to solve everything and that would be binding enough, an agreement that would come out of the Paris conference, is not that sure. We know that the climate change will involve costs which would be much higher than what we had thought initially. Negotiations are not going that well. The favorite instruments such as the carbon tax, the fuel taxes, are not very popular. There is a need for an international treaty, and the centralized treaty model didn't work. Economists have said that the only thing that is needed is a carbon pricing. And to a certain extent, we are right. Now, if fuel and coal were to be very expensive, or if the peak oil statements were right, we wouldn't have any problem. It would mean that we would be consuming less fossil fuels in a more efficient way. But how can we reach this objective of a pricing if the negotiations are going so badly? And I don't want to leave you with this very pessimistic message. I'd like to say that there is one thing better to be expected. That is something to be expected from renewables. This is a solar power plant on a former US air base in Germany, which has been converted into a power plant. The costs of renewables have been reduced by 99%. The quantity of solar power doubles every 2 years. Of course, all this is not enough. The problem has not been solved. But there's just a tiny hope. But the problem is that coal and fuel lobbies are still there, but they will lose power with the rise of the use of renewables and the lower prices of renewables. More research will be focusing on energy storage and other problems. But I think that the lobby of fossil fuels will be weakened, and maybe in the future we will come to international conventions and agreements and set a price on fossil fuels. There's a need for a price on fossil fuels because we will just be continuing using renewables and fossil fuels. And it would mean that we would consume 10 times more power and energy. So in a way or another, we should set a price on carbon. There should be a carbon pricing, but it's not going to be an easy task. And I'm not sure that we're going to agree on a carbon pricing in the COP21, but somehow we're moving in the right direction. And this will be concluding my lecture. This is the energy from wind farms and solar power plant. Thank you for your attention.